The second requirement of the offence of gross negligence manslaughter is that the defendant must breach their duty towards the victim and that this breach must be gross. In other words, it must be so serious a breach that it is considered criminal in nature. So this can really be broken down into two parts: breach and what it means for a breach to be gross. So let's look at each of them separately. So let's have a little look first at what it means to breach a duty. And let's look at a little scenario to help her. Now, this is Mrs. T and her live-in carer, Jemima. Now, unfortunately, Mrs. T passed away last week. And when she was examined by the doctors and a forensic expert, it turned out that her carer, Jemima, had failed to make sure she was eating. She'd failed to check if she'd taken her medication. She'd failed to call for a doctor when Mrs. T was really quite ill, and she'd left her soiled in her bed for days. And so Jemima has been charged with gross negligence manslaughter. Now, when we're looking at if there has been a breach, we look and see what the standard of care was in these types of situations. So what we would expect from the reasonable, competent person carrying out this activity. So Jemima would be compared with another carer in the situation and ask if she's fallen below that standard, which is like a bar, if you like. If she has fallen below that standard of care, then of course she will have breached that duty. And from what we've heard about her failure to look after Mrs. T, it looks as if she has fallen below that standard of care expected, and so she's breached her duty towards the victim. The fact that the duty has been breached is not enough on its own to find the defendant guilty of gross negligence manslaughter. The breach itself must also be considered gross, in that it fell so far below the standards to be expected of a person in the defendant's position, a carer, that it amounted to a crime. So here's our standard of care. To breach is to fall below that standard of care, but a gross breach is to fall so far below the standard expected that it amounts to a criminal act in the minds of the jury. It will, as I said, it will be up to the jury to decide if the breach was exceptionally bad, and the judge will tell the jury simple mistakes are not enough, and simply breaching is not enough. There needs to be a level of breach that makes it that turns it into a gross breach. So let's look at Mrs. T and Jemima again. Now we know that Jemima failed in a number of areas to look after Mrs. T properly. If those failures had simply been to leave her soiled in her bed and perhaps not to check often enough that she was eating, those might be just a breach. But the fact that she failed to call for a doctor and failed to check that Mrs. T was taking her medication, to my mind, this makes the breach gross in nature and potentially would mean that Jemima could be found guilty of gross negligence manslaughter.